Hi, I'm your host Sabrina Rice here on Paradigm Shift. Today we have another interesting topic on Federal Reserve. So you might want to stay tuned because, like always, we challenge the way that you think about things and dare you to face the truth. So stay tuned. We'll be right back just moments away. Hello and welcome back to our show Paradigm Shift. I'm here with our star of the show, Ray Mcberry, who is a former Republican candidate for governor of Georgia and has been seen on Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, and many other television and radio stations across the country. So today we're going to talk about the Federal Reserves. So Ray, tell us a little bit about what the Federal Reserve is and what it's not.
Well, I'm going to start with what it's not. Because with the name Federal Reserve, you would think that it is part of the federal government and that it has reserves in gold or silver stored away somewhere, Fort Knox or some other place. The truth is the Federal Reserve is neither federal nor does it have any reserves. The Federal Reserve Bank, or the Federal Reserve System, which is what it really is, it's actually neither one of those. It's a private bank that is working ostensibly under the guise of being part of the federal government, but it's not part of the federal government. I would guess that if we took a survey of the viewers that are watching the show before today's show, probably 90% of the people watching the show would say, if you asked them what is the Federal Reserve Bank, they would say it's the official government bank of the United States. It's not part of the government, though. And so many people just assume that because it's the Federal Reserve Bank, it must be part of the government. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's a private bank that loans money to the government, and the government has given the Federal Reserve authority that belongs to the government in the Constitution. So you have a private bank that is controlling our money supply, our economy, our interest rates, and basically performing functions that the Founding Fathers in the Constitution gave to the government to do. And so those very wealthy people that own the Federal Reserve Bank, they have much more control over the United States and our economy than the vast majority of people know about.
Okay. Well, what is the origin of the Federal Reserves in America?
Well, the Federal Reserve Bank is a creature that was established here in these United States, patterned after some banks in Europe. And I won't go through the whole history of it, but there was a very influential and wealthy family in Germany, the Rothschild family. Most people have probably heard of the Rothschilds. They've been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. The Rothschilds family, actually, the man who created the series of banks, system of banks in Europe, had several sons. He sent one son to England, one son to Germany, one son to France, and they basically started national banks in each of those countries in the late 17 and early 1800s. What they were doing is when the governments would get in trouble financially and need money, and they had taxed the people all they could tax them, then these banks, these national banks or central banks, would loan money to the governments of those countries at exorbitant amounts of money. And normally they also required that the government give them the authority to print the paper money for those countries. And so the Bank of England, for example, England was embroiled in a war, as it had been on numerous occasions, with France. And the King of England basically was, they were running out of money to finance the war. They needed to rebuild the English Navy. And so in order to come up with this money, the Rothschilds offered to loan the government money if the government of England would make them the National Bank of England. And that's how the Bank of England was chartered. The Bank of England literally loaned money to the government in England at a fairly high interest rate. They also charged an upfront user fee to the government to set everything up of several million pounds. And then they also required that the government of England give the authority to print the paper money of England to the Bank of England. So now the Bank of England not only is receiving payments from the government of England,
Right.
plus interest, but they also are in control of how much money is printed. So they could print money as much or as little as they wanted to.
Right.
At the same time that was going on in England, the National Bank of France was being created, which in turn was loaning money to the government of France, who was fighting England.
Wow.
And so what has happened is these national banks, as they've been established, they've taken over the authority of printing money in every country, taken that authority that originally belonged to the government in every country.
Right.
So now you have privately held banks that are in complete control of the economy of those different countries. Plus, it is in their best interest for the government to need to borrow money from the national bank,
Right.
which means that these families that are the owners and the investors of the national banks have in every generation intentionally encouraged wars between different countries, because they create the wars, they call for war in this country against this country, and they foment the war in each country,
Right.
and then they make money off both sides. They finance both sides of the conflict. The same thing happened here in these United States. We had early in American history, Alexander Hamilton was one of the big proponents for
Okay.
a national bank here in these United States, like
Right.
the one they had in England. And many of the founding fathers were very wary, very skeptical of a national bank. But eventually, these United States came to a point financially where money was necessary. The continental dollars that had been printed by the Continental Congress
Right.
during the Revolutionary War or the War for American Independence, Congress had printed so much of them, and the British had counterfeited so many of our continental dollars to destroy our economy that the continental dollars, they weren't worth very much anymore.
Right.
Inflation had eaten up their value.
Right.
So the U.S. government finally gave in and agreed to set up the Bank of the United States, the late 1700s, early 1800s. It was for a 20-year charter, and I think it was originally passed in 1816 when they finally got it through Congress and it was approved. Well, along came President Andrew Jackson.
Okay.
Andrew Jackson realized that a private bank controlling the economy of the country was not good for America.
Right.
In fact, it wasn't good for America then, it's not good for America
Now.
today, because those who own the private bank, they have their own best interest at heart,
Right.
not the interests that are necessarily the best interest of America.
Right.
And it's been that way in every country. So they're very self-serving, they're globalists, they don't care, they're not patriotic towards America, they're patriotic towards their own global interest,
Right.
and it means more money and more power for themselves. And so Andrew Jackson ran his presidential campaign on the promise to kill the national bank. And he was overwhelmingly elected. And so before the bank charter came up for renewal in 1836, I think 2 years prior to that, the people in Congress that were, I would say, in the pocket of the bankers,
Right.
they proposed a renewal of the bank a couple of years early. Well, Andrew Jackson was able to successfully kill the bank with his presidential veto. Congress couldn't get a 2/3 majority to override the veto, so it killed the national bank.
Wow.
And the national bank in these United States stayed dead, for almost 100 years. President Andrew Jackson, though I don't agree with everything he did as a president, that was a great service that he performed to America, to the
Right.
people of America.
Of course.
And not only did he kill the national bank, but he paid off the entire national debt while he was president. It was the last time that we had no national debt. Andrew Jackson literally paid off everything, because the concept of the national bank is that it encourages borrowing.
Right.
And so the federal government is constantly borrowing money from the national bank. So in that situation, in that scenario, there's no incentive to ever totally pay off the national debt, because the debt is basically the reflection of how much paper money has been printed. So if the government ever paid off all of the national debt that it owed to the Federal Reserve Bank, why, there wouldn't be any money out there. And so having a national bank like the Federal Reserve Bank constantly encourages the government to be borrowing more money. There's no incentive to ever pay off the national debt. So anyone watching who thinks that we're ever going to pay off the national debt as long as we have the Federal Reserve System, you're totally mistaken, totally misled. No one in Washington is ever going to pay off the national debt as long as there's a national bank, which is the Federal Reserve. So that brings us up to the creation of our Federal Reserve Bank. That's the background in Europe and here. So early in the 20th century, 1910, there were a group of very wealthy individuals here in these United States who also had business dealings with the Rothschilds over in Europe. They wanted to create a national bank here that would be just like the Bank of England and the national banks in France and Germany and Austria, the other countries there in Europe. And so these men, very powerful, very wealthy, many of them already involved in banking, railroads, oil, names that you would recognize. We'll put some of them up on the screen here. Those men met secretly on a railroad car that was leaving New York and New Jersey, headed to the destination of the small island off the coast of Georgia, Jekyll Island.
Jekyll Island.
And those men met in secret. They did not want the American people to know that they were all meeting together, because these were the most wealthy, powerful men in America. And if anyone got wind that they were meeting together, some of those men in Congress who were patriotic would know what they were up to and would put an end to it. Well, they secretly met and they came up with their plan to create a national bank here in these United States. They knew that the United States was somewhat in financial turmoil because some of the banks had been overlending, extending more credit than what they had reserves for. It had created several panics, several runs on the bank. Some historians even say that those wealthy, influential men caused that to happen so that the American people would accept their idea of a national bank. In secret, they came up with their plan for the Federal Reserve System. It would be a couple of years later, in 1913, when the Federal Reserve System was actually adopted by law in Congress. And there's a very interesting story about how it was actually created, how the vote took place there in Congress. We don't have time to go into all that. I encourage the viewers to look it up for themselves. But what happened is that very wealthy group of men on Jekyll Island came up with a plan to create the national bank and basically paid off members of Congress to support it, to push it through. And so in 1913, the Federal Reserve Bank of these United States was created. Since then, the Federal Reserve Bank not only is a lending institution that loans money to the federal government, it was given the authority by Congress to print the paper money for these United States. The power, in fact, that was given to Congress by the Constitution. And Congress turned around and handed it over to the Federal Reserve Bank, which is not part of the federal government, but is a private bank. So today, if you want to know who's running the economy in these United States, who controls the amount of inflation, who sets the interest rates, it's not the federal government, in spite of what a lot of people think. It is a privately owned bank with very wealthy individuals in control of it, controlling our economy with their own best interest at heart, not necessarily the best interest of the American people.
Wow. Well, that's very interesting. And, you know, Well, let me ask you this. As far as like going back into history, can you make any comparisons to, the central banks, back in history to the Federal Reserve?
Absolutely. We already talked about the Bank of England.
Right.
The Bank of England was responsible for financing England, rebuilding their navy to be able to continue their ongoing wars with France.
Of course.
France, of course, very ambitious, trying to expand their borders before Napoleon came to power, and then, of course, after Napoleon came to power, he was trying to take over and almost took over all of Europe. And the Rothschilds owned the national banks in England and in France and in Austria, and they were making money off of financing both sides of the wars all throughout the 17 and 1800s in Europe.
Right.
It's the same way today. Those national bankers, international bankers, they own the national banks in all the major countries, and they create wars all the time around the globe so that they can in turn finance both sides of the conflicts, and they're the ones that profit from wars. So if you want to know why there's constant war, that's your reason.
So what exactly are the powers of the Federal Reserve? And I mean, would you say that it's, dangerous?
It's definitely dangerous to the people.
Right.
They, number one, have the authority now to print money. And so the Federal Reserve Bank or the national bank in whatever country, if they have the authority, the power to print paper money, that controls the inflation. The more money you print, the less each one is worth.
Right.
And so eventually you have a situation where as they print more and more and more money, they're gaining wealth for themselves, but it is the average American who is losing money. The government is borrowing money from the Federal Reserve Bank, so they're going to get paid. But it's you and I that are carrying around these Federal Reserve notes in our pockets. Every day that we carry Federal Reserve notes in our pockets, a 5, a 10, or a 20, it's worth less today than it was yesterday, because the more they print, the less it's worth. It's actually an indirect way of taxing the people without the people even knowing that they've been taxed, because what they have in their pockets has lost value today from what it was yesterday.
Hello and welcome back to your show Paradigm Shift. I'm your host Sabrina Rice, and I'm here again with Ray Mcberry, our star of the show. And today we've been talking about the Federal Reserve. So Ray, I know that we've talked a little bit. You've given us some background in the history of the Federal Reserves and and the central banking. And tell us a little bit more about the money that's printed. Is it real? I mean, what can Americans do with it?
Well, paper money is different than coins.
Right.
Originally, the Constitution gave Congress the authority to print money and to mint coins.
Of course.
Coins, if they're made from a precious metal like gold and silver, they have intrinsic value. People are going to want the gold and the silver no matter what happens to the government, no matter what happens, in world events. Gold and silver is always going to have value. In fact, gold and silver, if you had an ounce of gold today, it would buy approximately the same amount of goods that it would have bought 100 years ago. Now, prices have gone up, but the amount of goods you could have purchased with that, whether it be bread or lumber or anything like that, though the prices of those goods have gone up, the price of gold has gone up too. So an ounce of gold today would still buy you approximately the same thing that an ounce of gold 100 years ago would have bought.
Okay.
Same thing with silver, because those precious metals hold their value. In fact, as there's more and more paper money in the world today, there's a greater demand for gold and silver, which is why gold and silver's value has actually gone up in the last few years, even in relation to the amount that you could buy with it. And so gold and silver, it rarely ever loses its value. It always has some value to it. Paper money is the opposite. Paper money, the more you print of it, the less it's worth. And in fact, when the Federal Reserve began printing paper money here in these United States, originally the plan that was sold to the American people is that the federal government would keep enough gold in reserves in Fort Knox or some other place like Fort Knox, that there would always be enough gold and silver in reserve to back up the amount of paper money that was printed. And so that in the 1920s, 1930s, you could go down to the Federal Reserve Bank and you could literally exchange your Federal Reserve notes for gold or silver if you chose to do that. It's a lot harder to carry around a pocket full of gold and silver, and maybe easier to lose too, but you could swap it out. In the 1930s, President FDR confiscated all of the gold that was owned by American citizens, and so at that point you could no longer turn your paper money in for gold. There were still silver notes out there for a few years after that, but eventually, by the time FDR and the international bankers got through destroying America's economy, now you can't take your Federal Reserve notes anywhere to a bank and just swap it out for gold and silver. In fact, if you do that today, they're going to laugh at you. They're not going to give you gold or silver. And in reality, there probably are no gold reserves in Fort Knox. If there is, it wouldn't matter because there's been so much money printed by the Federal Reserve Bank since 1913. There's nowhere near enough gold and silver that the U.S. government has ever owned to equal the value of all the paper money that's been printed. It's called fiat currency. There's nothing to back up the value of our paper money today except the promise of the government that it's good.
Oh, wow. So,
I don't know about you, but I don't always necessarily believe that the government's word is good about anything, and if the government financially declares bankruptcy or collapses, which the truth is it could do at any time, that paper money would be just as worthless as the wheelbarrow loads of money that the Germans had before World War II when the Weimar Republic collapsed, because they printed so much money that you could literally take a wheelbarrow load of it to the bakery to buy a loaf of bread. And so paper money has no intrinsic value. Its only value is that either it's backed by gold and silver, which it no longer is here in America, or it's backed by the promise of the government's word that it's good. And so the more they print, the less it's worth. The Federal Reserve Bank also, it creates money out of thin air. When they lend money to other banks, who in turn lend money to individuals, we have gotten off the standard many, many years ago of having enough money in reserves to equal the amount of money that the bank is lending out. What we have in America today is called fractional reserve lending. And so fractional reserve means that if the government, if the Federal Reserve Bank has, I'm just going to use an example, if they have $1 million that they're going to lend out, or that they have in reserves where deposits have been made, they can lend out approximately 8 times that amount to other banks or individuals with only 20% of the reserves of what they're lending out. So you have banks, every time a bank makes a loan, they don't have enough reserves in cash to equal what they're lending out. They only are required to keep 10 to 20% of that on hand in reserves, which means every time a bank, including the Federal Reserve Bank, makes a loan, they're creating more money out of thin air. And so, of course, that makes the rest of our money worth less. The more money is created, what we have in existence is worth less. So the paper money, it's not real money, it's fiat currency, has no real value. Only gold and silver actually has value.
Wow. So you've given us a little bit of information about the fractional reserve banking. Now, let me ask you this. What is the significance about the bank bailout? Can you give us a little bit about that?
Yeah, the big bank bailout that we had several years ago, President Bush the younger is the one that started the process. Barack Obama didn't stop it. He let it go forward. And it was a bailout of the big banks that all do business, of course, with the Federal Reserve Bank,
Right.
because they're all in cahoots together, to be quite honest with you. The same investors who owned the big national banks around the country, they also are the ones that are the investors who own the Federal Reserve Bank. They loan money to themselves, to their own banks, and they in turn make loans to individuals and businesses. Well, they were never going to allow their banks to collapse because they're making money for themselves.
Right. Right.
So when the federal government stepped in and said, we're going to bail out the big banks because they're too big to fail, it would it would hurt the American economy. People wouldn't be able to go and get loans from anywhere. They basically said these big banks can do whatever they want to, make loans however they want to make them. We're not going to let them go under.
Right.
And so again, the American people are the ones that had to foot the bill for the bad banking decisions that were made by the big international bankers who, at the very heart of it, they're also the investors who own the Federal Reserve Bank and are making money off all of it anyway. So again, the American people paying for the bad decisions of the bankers. The bankers are still doing well. It's the American people who suffer.
So with that being said, do you feel like that there's any fraudulence going on in the Federal Reserves today? I mean, how do you feel about that?
Well, the Federal Reserve Bank is definitely, first of all, it's unconstitutional. Congress is supposed to be in charge of the money that's coined or printed.
Right.
And so the fact that we're allowing individuals who have their own best interest at heart to be making decisions that affect the economy for the entire United States, that's just a travesty of justice, I think. Most people just have no idea that it's a private bank that's doing all of this.
Well, is anything being done to make the American people aware of this?
Several years ago, Ron Paul proposed a bill in Congress to audit the Federal Reserve, which would, number one, show that they had no reserves to back up all the money they printed. Number two, it would begin to divulge to the American people the fact that it is a private bank. Also, there have been a few legislators at the state level, not many, but a few around the country, who have proposed taxing the Federal Reserve banks in each state, just like we tax other banks. Every other bank has to pay taxes. The Federal Reserve banks have been given a free pass on paying taxes, and yet they're the ones making the most money. And they get away with it because most people say, well, you can't tax the federal government. Well, they're not the federal government. They're a private bank, and they should be taxed. In our state alone here in Georgia, one of my good friends several years ago in the state legislature proposed taxing the Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta. Had that passed, there would have been enough revenue generated from taxing that bank to have taken care of the entire budget for the state of Georgia for the year.
Wow. So what would be another alternative to, the federal banks and, without, destroying the economy?
Well, the main thing is we need to get back to the point that Congress, the government, is actually the one
Get to the source.
who is controlling the coins that are minted and the money that's printed, if any paper money is going to be printed. It should not be in the hands of private individuals who are looking after their own interests, not the interest of our country. Secondly of all, people say, well, you could never do that today. You can't get rid of that. Well, you could still begin to work back towards a gold and silver standard where the money that's out there does have some value, something of value backing it, besides just the promise of the government. We couldn't do that overnight. It would greatly restrict the amount of money in the economy, but we could begin to work towards that, and we could begin to use digital credits that were based on gold and silver reserves that the government does have. And so if Congress really wanted to ever pay off our debt and make us a solid financial entity again as a nation, they would have to take this authority away from the central bank, from the Federal Reserve. Whether that will ever happen or not remains to be seen.
Wow. Well, that's going to do it for today's show, our hot topic on the Federal Reserve. I hope that you've learned something new today, and will stay tuned for our next episode. Remember, the truth shall make you free. Until then, see you next time.